America, featuring the remarks of John Jacob, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Urban League. Our Journalist Roundtable program re-airs at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, that's 6 Pacific. This week, the program originated from the Washington Bureau of the Chicago Tribune. Finally, at 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time, it's a Close-Up Foundation Current Issues program, which focuses on the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's a quick look ahead on C-SPAN. Thank you for watching. Up next, the United States and Gulf Security, a forum sponsored by the Johns Hopkins Foreign Policy Institute.
Good morning. I would like to welcome you all to this panel discussion being held by the Johns Hopkins Foreign Policy Institute on the subject of the United States and Gulf security. As you may have noticed, the main speaker today is not who was advertised. Secretary Weinberger let us know on Thursday that, much to his own regret, he could not be here this morning. He had to take his wife up to Maine. As you know, she's in delicate health, and one can understand why these things do come up sometimes at the last minute. His appearance is merely postponed, not canceled. He will appear at a related meeting on these subjects later this spring. We were very, very pleased that Secretary Haig, on very short notice, graciously agreed to appear this morning. As a result, we probably will be hearing a somewhat different view of these questions. The format is that Secretary Haig will speak for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then he will be followed by Hal Sonnenfeld and Jeff Kemp, as planned, who will be appearing as discussants. They'll talk for not more than 10 minutes each, and following that, we'll be glad to take questions and have discussion with this large and diverse audience. As you know, Hal Sonnenfeld is at the Brookings Institution. His last government position was with the State Department as counselor up through the beginning of 1977. Jeff Kemp is at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He served from 1981 through 1984 as a member of the NSC staff and a special assistant to the president. Secretary Haig, of course, doesn't need any introduction, but I can't avoid one, nor can I avoid a story that if I don't tell, he will tell, and I just soon have my spin on it. It was in, I think, late 78 or early 1979 that a terrorist attempt was made on Secretary Haig's life. They tried to blow up his car. And on hearing this, I telephoned him, then being Secretary of Defense, to say that we were pleased that it had not succeeded, and to let him know that, as I said, Al, we want you to know that we didn't do it. He has subsequently amended this story, as people do when they write memos of conversation, so that they come out well, to say that he responded, I know you didn't do it. You wouldn't have come that close. That may have been in his mind at the time, But since he had not yet decided to exchange the mantle of Napoleon for that of George Washington, he was somewhat circumspect about what he was thinking. But it is clear that then and subsequently, in subsequent administration, Al Haig is very willing to express his own views and to make them known and to take responsibility for them. He has served his country in a variety of positions for 40 years. His operational military service in the Far East during the Korean War, in Vietnam, and then as Supreme Allied Commander Europe testify to this. Beginning during the Nixon administration, early in the Nixon administration, having served beforehand in the Office of the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, but during the Nixon administration he was on the National Security Council staff when Henry Kissinger ran that activity. He then became Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and then at a time of crisis went back over to the White House to be President Nixon's Chief of Staff. He is widely credited with managing a very unusual transition in the presidency. Subsequently, he was named to be Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, came back to the United States on his retirement, entered business, becoming president of the United Technologies Corporation, and then with the Reagan administration becoming Secretary of State. He had in that post his own views on foreign and security policy, sometimes agreeing, sometimes not with the official administration view. As I said, he is outspoken on these matters, and now I think we will be in a position to find out what he thinks about the following kinds of questions. What were the objectives of the recent U.S. actions over the past 9 months or so in the Persian Gulf region? How well have they served U.S. interests in the region? And what happens next? Secretary Al Haig.
I'm always thrilled to have an introduction from Harold Brown. He distorts revisionism is a great school of thought here in modern Washington. Now, I have to say I'm extremely pleased. Harold called me in London on Saturday last, and I had a full day scheduled there and a family wedding in Princeton. It was Friday morning, a family wedding in Princeton on Saturday. I'm just back in town, so that's a warning that you may get a combination of the traditional Haig twisted logic as well as jet lag, and that's a double risk for you. But I want you to know I'm very, very pleased to be here. This is probably the largest crowd I've been able to muster in many, many months. While we were out around the coffee pot, Dick Fairbanks came up to me. He said, "Al, you must be crushed. They've been so manhandled in the recent campaign." I said, "Not at all." I said, "I'm totally fulfilled. You see, I've been a White House Chief of Staff. I've been Secretary of State. I've been a NATO commander, a president of a large corporation. And indeed, during Watergate, I was President of the United States. What I'd never been was a presidential candidate. Now I've done that, and I can tell you I'm totally fulfilled. And if I'd been wise and listened to my friend Mort Saul, that long-of-tooth commentator on contemporary America, he said, "Al, you'll never make it." I said, "Why, Al?" He said, "Because unlike the other candidates, everyone knows you mean to do what you promise. And that frightens them." I don't know whether that's true or not. Now, particularly pleased to have an opportunity to discuss an area that I suppose I follow with more casual than intense interest in the last year. And I'm pleased also to have Jeff Kemp here, who was in the NSC at the time of the original foundation for the current dilemmas were put in place. And I must say, I'm also pleased to speak for my friend Cap Weinberger. You know, you probably don't know it, but Cap and I stayed in communication throughout the time he was Secretary of Defense and I was Secretary of State. Sometimes it was private communication, mostly it was public. And finally we had to institute a weekly breakfast, just the two of us alone in our taster. And Jeff frequently was responsible for the menu. Isn't that right, Jeff? I'm also very, very pleased to have Hal Sonnenfeld here because Hal and I go way, way back. In fact, he was very close to the, I call the focus of policy when the real historic events occurred in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East region that I think also have contributed to today's contradictions and difficulties. I remember very actively in, I think it was 1975, and I had just arrived in NATO, and the implementation of the Labor Party's stated objective of withdrawing from east of Suez was about to occur. Now, I was very, very, very concerned about that, and I rushed over to London to see Jim Callahan, and I went in and I said, Jim, for God's sake, don't do this. I said, if necessary, thin out your forces in the central region of NATO, but don't create a vacuum in the Persian Gulf where only British diplomacy and experience and credibility has historically served the role of managing to balance a number of conflicting regional views. Unfortunately, the British Treasury was then in such a bad state of ill repair, and my friend Dr. Kissinger and Bill Simon, Secretary of the Treasury at the time, were unwilling to fill the gap, and we have been subsequently paying the price because it was then necessary to place burdens on the Shah of Iran for a regional stability role that he was simply unable to carry out. Now, I'm going to do something I don't often do, and I'm going to stay very close to my notes because this has been a hastily contrived epistle. And I would like to make at the outset several points. First, we waited too long to work towards bringing an end to the war in the Gulf between Iraq and Iran for understandable, though very short-sighted reasons. Our present policy and its posture derives less from a considered strategy and more from the press of events after the Iran-Contra affair. Second, despite some complacency of the moment, we are in a very awkward position that ultimately could benefit Moscow. There's no reason for us to sit idly by waiting for disaster. We should elevate this issue high on the agenda of U.S.-Soviet relations, specifically on the Soviet position on the UN resolutions to embargo the movement of arms into the region, and specifically Iran. Third, we should coordinate with our allies and start the planning for a post-war security structure of fairly shared burdens that at the same time preserves Western interests. Now, too many today look with frustration at the NATO alliance as the vehicle or the mechanism for accomplishing that coordination. I would reject that and suggest that it must be somewhat more uniquely based, even at the risk of resurrecting the directorate concept in Europe, the major powers, and broaden it to include Japan as a minimum in the Pacific. I think we failed to move in this direction over the last 7 years with the coherence and determination that was necessary. Fourth, we must also conduct our diplomacy in such a way that we do not foreclose a constructive relationship with Iran, although that, in fact, may not be possible as long as Khomeini lives. But in deriving such profound conclusions, too frequently in America, and especially here in Washington, we live in snapshots of time, orgies of revisionism, in which we seldom assess in depth how we got into the messes we are in, and therefore how best to work our way out of them. And I'd like to take a few moments to do that this morning. Let me begin with how we got here, the better to understand how to get out of this sort of fix and to avoid it in the future. Some years ago, as Secretary of State, I was present at a seminar where one of the professors discussing the Gulf War declared that the war was a pure test of U.S. geopolitical interests. Other issues or other considerations that normally affect American foreign policy in particular were completely absent. We had nothing in common either with Iraq or the Iranian society. Each regime offended our sense of human rights. Their effective neutralization of each other, in fact, paralyzed the two most anti-American governments in the region. All of this was true and remains largely true today. Yet at the same time, despite the apparent advantages of having the war go on, when I was Secretary of State, I had concluded that we needed to bring the war to an end without victory for either side. First, the longer the war went on, the more danger that some of our friends would be sucked in or that the oil traffic would be menaced. Second, the longer it went on, the more the Iranian military, perhaps our best remaining friends in Iran, would be displaced by the Revolutionary Guards and non-Western arms supplies, with all of the leverage associated therewith. Third, the longer it went on, the more valuable Moscow might become as the intermediary who supplied arms to both sides and could manipulate both sides. Now, all of these things have come to pass as Iran and Iraq have fought a war that has claimed hundreds of thousands of casualties and $100 billion. Iraq has the technological superiority that should bring victory. But the Iraqi military tactics will surely become the textbook cases of how not to conduct a military campaign. Eschewing maneuver, the Iraqis have tried instead to substitute firepower for mobility, hoping to stall the Iranians through defensive lines and the cutoff of Iranian oil exports through the tanker war begun by Iraq in 1984. The stakes are the survival of the Arab oil powers. Iran has sought, through a war of attrition, to wear out the numerically inferior Iraqis. The Iranians consider themselves to be the vanguard of an even larger effort to spread their version of Islam through religious fervor and through terrorism. If they succeed in cracking Iraq, the Iranians expect to dominate much of the Arab world. The stake here is the survival of Khomeiniism. After all, if even the great Satan, the United States, could be humiliated, not to defeat the hated Iraqis raises the question of whether Khomeini is really the elect of God. Each side in this contest has registered important successes. On the battlefield itself, the Iraqis have managed to deny the Iranians a decisive victory, though conceding territory in the process. The Gulf states, through trying too often to play both sides, have eventually come to believe that Iranian imperialism is a clear and present danger, and all the more dangerous because of its religious appeal. Fearful of an Iranian victory, the U.S. has clearly tilted toward Iraq, beginning as early as 1983 with the sale of dual-capable aircraft. We have done so despite the fact that until recently, Iraqi raids on shipping were the real danger in the Gulf trade war. In this instance also, U.S. moralism has not dominated our policy, as we've left it to the press to condemn the use of poison gas by the Iraqi government. The Iranians have obtained access to ready supplies of arms. At crucial points, they've been able to press their offensives and inflict huge costs on Iraqi smaller forces. Tehran has also succeeded in forging valuable alliances. Its Syrian relationship has allowed Khomeini to gain influence in Lebanon. The French have been up and down in Tehran, lately more up. Khomeini's government has used terrorism very effectively to pursue these relationships. The Gulf War has also spilled over into that other Middle East conflict, the Arab-Israeli struggle. In one sense, it has helped U.S. diplomacy by tending to neutralize the anti-Camp David coalition, giving the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty more time to grow or at least weather the storm. It has also aided in drawing Egypt back into the Arab world because of the sheer necessity to balance the Iranian threat. But in another sense, it has been very harmful. Since 1979, two major leaders associated with the United States have, of course, gone, the Shah and Sadat. The United States has been humiliated twice through Iranian hostage operations, the embassy seizure in 1980, and the Iran-Contra affair in '86. And in between, we were driven out of Lebanon through a combined Syrian-Iranian terrorism. I believe that if we had retaliated promptly against the Iranian camps in the Bekaa Valley when our embassy was blown up in 1983, we might have earned a little respect in Tehran and in Damascus as well. But be that as it may, the results of these experiences have greatly harmed our prestige, our credibility, and the peace process in the region. And I must also mention the proliferation of advanced weapons, including the new Chinese missiles, the so-called CSS-2, an 1,800-mile dual-capable missile reported to be larger than our own Minuteman III, although obviously not as sophisticated. Emplacements for this are reportedly being built in Saudi Arabia. For those of us who recall the Iraqi nuclear program in 1980 and 1981 and the Israeli raid on it, this scenario looks all too worrisome and familiar. As for our policy in the Gulf War itself, I believe that if not for our hostages in Lebanon and the folly that produced the Iran-Contra scandal, the United States would simply have continued its policy of tilting rather gradually towards Iraq, but otherwise staying very distant from engagements on the very front lines. So that is my first point. Our current policy does not derive from any considered strategy either to end the war or to help one side win. It is largely the result of a gradual tilt, accelerated into a naval presence, both by the consequences of the failed approach to Iran and the subsequent heavy blow, once again, to our prestige. We can try to rationalize it all we like, even engaging, as I say, in revisionism. But the truth is that the Kuwaiti reflagging came about because we feared the Soviets would pick up the advantage if we gave further signs of weakness in the Gulf. Instead, however, by putting our forces in the line of fire to protect Kuwait, a state which incidentally has never been particularly helpful to American foreign policy, we risked a major clash with Iran that has naturally played into Moscow's hands. In my view, the Soviets are also interested in ending the war, but essentially through their own auspices. The war, after all, has caused them immense damage. In the course of it, the Khomeini regime solidified and Moscow's two-day party was annihilated in Tehran. Iraq, as a Soviet arms dependent and leader of the anti-Camp David coalition, has been weakened. Syria, another Soviet arms client, has been left isolated with an alliance of convenience to Iran that has made the pursuit of Soviet objectives in Lebanon all the more difficult. On the other hand, if Moscow could arrange a Tashkent, a settlement of the war through its mediation, some of this damage would be undone. The Soviet Union, rather than the United States, would emerge as the arbiter of the Gulf. This would give the Soviets a very useful leverage in regaining a footing in Tehran for the post-Khomeini period. It would also give them superb credentials for mediation in the Arab-Israeli conflict through an international conference. So I would say that Iraq and the Soviet Union both hope for a strong clash between the U.S. Navy and Iran. The Iraqis because they want us to make war for them, and the Soviets because they want Tehran to come for help against the United States. So we were, and we are, face to face with this dreadful paradox. If attacked, we must retaliate. We cannot afford to lose face once more to Khomeini. But if we retaliate in a robust fashion, our very successes drive Iran towards the Soviet. We were faced with that dilemma a year or so ago, and we chose a very benign response to some radar sites on an offshore oil rig. Believe me, after spending 6 months on the political hustings, I can tell you that a bloody nose for the Ayatollah would bring cheers from the American people. Instantaneous and overwhelming. But a war with Iran continues to make no sense to the Americans at large. That's why I call our current policy the Bloody Nose Express. It will work once, but public support will decline rapidly thereafter. We never learned that with the covert operations in Nicaragua until recently. I believe that we have been spared this disaster simply because the Iranians do not want to be forced to go to Moscow. They have concentrated instead on trying to repeat Lebanon, to drive us out through small attacks, or to repeat 1979 in Mecca by inspiring anti-U.S. attacks in the Muslim world. None of this has worked, except the hostage game with the French. Tehran has bought some time, but still must confront the fact of a hostile coalition against which it is unlikely to prevail. Some have hailed our policy as a success. Some do so today. I suspect your primary speaker might have done so. Because we have managed, and this is true, the escort service without casualties, and because happily we've been joined by our allies in the effort. But the Gulf is now much more dangerous for all shipping. And we are finding it more difficult to continue to keep such a large naval force on continuous patrol, especially as the revulsion to all things defense-oriented grows in the political process here in America. So we are hanging out in the Gulf with the choice of escalation in the hands of Iran and Iraq, secure from a major incident, I am convinced, only by the desire of the Iranians not to be forced towards Moscow. This situation may not prevail forever. I have to ask why, when 20,000 of our fleet are at the mercy of such events, Washington does not act more forcefully to demand that Moscow get off the comfortable fence which it now straddles. A UN embargo resolution would send a definite signal to Iran that divide and fight in the Gulf no longer works, and that everyone wants an end to the combat. So long as the Soviets hold out, our forces are at risk, and that risk may grow depending on factionalism in Tehran. Now I remind you that the embassy seizure in 1979 came as a result of such factional fighting in Tehran, rather than a deliberate act of policy by the then Iranian government. Think back to the speculations following the Brzezinski meeting in Algiers. This is my second point. We should change the conditions that put our fleet in danger and allow Moscow to broker both sides, and the key, unfortunately, is simply the UN resolution and subsequent potential actions. There should be no further delay in elevating this issue to the priority list on U.S.-Soviet relations. Now may I divert for a moment with the abandonment of linkage in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy, which I decry, and which has led us, in the interest of the image of improved East-West relations and the compulsion for arms control and arms control's sake, to abandon a fundamental principle of American, at least Republican American foreign policy that has served us so well for 2 decades. And wasn't it ironic to find Mr. Schultz confronted in the recent meeting with Shevardnadze with reversed linkage applied by the Soviet Union? My third point has to do with our allies. We've had a long debate for many years about how to handle so-called out-of-area crises, events that affect NATO security but are not in the geographical limits of the treaty itself. The Gulf War is a prime example. Today, Western Europe and Japan depend far more on Gulf oil than we do. Moreover, an important U.S. ally, Turkey, also a member of NATO, is instrumental today in both Iran and Iraq. I think prudently so. The Turks are watching the latest Iranian northern strategy with great interest. They have a Kurdish problem. They take oil from Iraq, and far more than the USSR. They are likely to be a practical outlet for a pipeline from Iran. And I believe the Turks will not stand by idly if Iran tries to rearrange the political geography of a defeated Iraq. My point is that now, with other allied fleets in the area, and with the United States bearing a large military burden for the defense of Western interests in the Gulf through our rapid deployment force, the time is overripe for a new allied coordination. That would never be achievable under a foreign policy of jolts, surprises, and post facto notification of our friends of critical new initiatives involving their security. We cannot afford a repetition of the Beirut fiasco, where we all had troops and the U.S. proved to be totally indecisive. Our policy should be thoroughly coordinated with our allies. They should see that part of the burden is theirs to bear as well. For if there's one lesson in all of this, it must be that the peace of the Gulf continues to require, as it has historically, a strong Western presence, and hopefully one more facile and experienced in Middle Eastern diplomacy. The old Twin Pillars thesis, which we hoped for in the Nixon era, you'll recall, Hal, would give us security exclusively through a local balance. It's been a casualty of events in the Middle East. We've got to look ahead to a security structure for the post-war period that safeguards Western interests. And I would suggest there are parallel observations to be made with respect to the troubled NATO alliance that I know so well. Now, my fourth and final point. Iran remains the geopolitical prize in the Gulf. We know it, they know it, everyone knows it. Nor can anyone who knows history and looks back on the evolution of this conflict conclude that Iraq is some kind of a white knight. The conditions for resuming constructive relationships with Tehran will never be produced through an overwhelming U.S. tilt towards Iraq that will prove to be indecisive in the war. Nor will they be brought about through cake and Bible diplomacy that is a textbook example of substituting covert action for real, coherent foreign policy. And I reject entirely the quixotic search for so-called moderates to justify any diplomatic enterprise while we simultaneously ignore our own rhetoric. And fundamentally, effective policy must be based on mutual interest. The U.S. and Iran, even the revolutionary regime, have certain interests in common, including stable oil prices, free flow in the Gulf, and a region not dominated by the Soviet Union. When the power
The history that is evoked by what the Soviets are doing in the Gulf and in the region to the south of them is very reminiscent of what went on in Berlin between Molotov and Ribbentrop and Hitler in November 1940, when the Soviets sought and all but obtained a free hand from the Germans in the regions to the south in exchange for deals with the Germans in the Baltic states and elsewhere in Europe. And I think that is not a matter of communist ideology or whether the Soviets are a brutal totalitarian system at home or a more open reforming system, but it is a matter of long-standing Soviet geopolitical interests. And I think, therefore, we need to be very, very careful before we, in effect, make ourselves the sponsors of active Soviet diplomatic and political roles in these parts of the world in particular. Now, there may have to be some price to be paid for getting the Soviets to do some of the things that we want them to do with respect to certain of the areas, but I would say we probably will mislead ourselves severely if we somehow regard this, what I would hope to be the minimum necessary involvement by the Soviets insofar as we have any control over it. We would delude ourselves if we somehow made it in our own minds a function of the fact that there's some sort of reform going on in the Soviet Union. I don't think in these issues reform makes a great deal of difference one way or the other. Indeed, if anything, it may make the Soviets more capable to understand and see and define their interests than they are when they are encumbered by the baggage of Marxism-Leninism.
Al, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment because I agree essentially with what Hal said, and I knew if I gave him a chance he'd prove he was more hawkish than I am.
That's easy.
But the point that's relevant here is to get Soviet support for the UN resolution. And it's my conviction that this is not mutually exclusive from the observations Hal made. When we started the dialogue with the Soviet Union, rather belatedly, too belatedly, that dialogue was a product not of some desire to improve East-West relations on the part of the Soviet Union as some kind of a lofty goal, but out of sheer necessity. Soviets within the failures within the Soviet system. I am to believe that in dealing with this minor objective of getting a Soviet acquisition to the enforcement of a UN resolution, that we had more than enough leverage to do it without suddenly making them the kingpin of events in the Persian Gulf. There was another school of thought, incidentally, when we talked about the flagging, that perhaps it would have been better to let the Soviets, and this is worth debate, let the Soviets have made that entry, let them take all the risks with the parties, and face them with the same conundrums we're facing today, because they probably wouldn't have done it a great deal better than we've been able to do it. I think that could be debated. The point I'm trying to make is it doesn't mean that you have brought the Soviet Union into the process, either on the Middle East and the International Conference, or in the solution to Middle East Persian Gulf problems, because they merely join a consensus already arrived at within the United Nations. And if we try to equate them in too dramatic terms, we'll lose our enthusiasm for getting on with this, some teeth in this UN resolution.
I think we've managed to elicit some difference of opinion, at least on this detail.
Well, I don't want this to be described as a dovish position, but I think perhaps it's a little more complex. I mean, my judgment is the Soviets are a little divided amongst themselves about how to handle the dilemma that we've all spelled out. I mean, whether to really put their money on Iran because of the post-Afghanistan problems and the fact that Iran is a prize, or whether or not to piggyback and get more involved in Arab politics and eventually the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think there's a division of opinion about this in Moscow based on a recent trip I just took there. Secondly, I think there is genuine fear in Moscow that is genuine in Moscow but paranoid from at least my perspective, that somehow we are planning to go back into Iran when the war is over, and that somehow this enormous armada in the Gulf is going to stay. And therefore, to this extent, I think Al Haig's absolutely right. The Soviets have a strong interest in supporting an end to the war, if only to get a lot of the U.S. forces out. I think the other point I'd make is that within the region itself, there is enough going on in terms of social dynamics to put the fear of God, if that's the right phrase, into any Soviet diplomat who advocates further and more deep embroilment in Gulf politics. I mean, if there's one lesson, it seems to me, from the Afghani experience and their own understanding or misunderstanding of fundamentalism, it is that they are perhaps as confused as we are about where all this is leading. And therefore, I think we should not rule out the fact that this is not a monolithic region and that the Soviet Union may have no more success, in fact, I would guess much less success than we would, if they had a free rein to try to extend their sort of diplomatic tentacles into that region short of war.
It seems to me that we've heard now several comments that suggest that trade-offs are best made within the context of a particular situation, and none of my three colleagues has advocated, so far as I know, linkage in the sense of saying we get the Soviets to do what we want in the Iran-Iraq war by threatening them, well, by either threatening or promising something in strategic arms negotiations. The most, in my judgment, that can be done in those terms is a recognition that linkage in the political sense exists as a political fact of life in the United States. If relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union are bad because of regional issues, then it's more difficult for the U.S. to reach strategic agreements with the Soviet Union. But if you're dealing with a regional issue, then you have to get the Soviets to come along on the basis of their own interest. Or if you're trying to link it with something else, you have to offer them something in the other place. Phil Jalen.
Phil Jones from the Washington Post. You just raised a subject that I wanted to ask Secretary Haig about, and which Hal Sonnenfeld also raised but didn't want to ask him about, which is what kind of linkage are you precisely recommending? Because it seems to be the key to your solution to this problem. Are you talking about linkage, as Hal said, in which is tied to arms control, or just to the general tone of relations? And further, in answering that, would you illustrate what you mean by saying that the principle of linkage has served us so well for so long under a Republican administration?
I asked for that, didn't I?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think Harold's already helped me a great deal on my concept of linkage. And it is indeed that, not some rigid mechanistic formula in which we tell the Soviets a priori, you terminate the wars of liberation, the destabilizing of the free world or the non-aligned world, and then we'll sit down and negotiate arms control. It's far more subtle, but it isn't abandoned. And we really, again, have to avoid revisionism. It was very evident to me in 1980, the end of the Carter administration, that the opportunities for improved East-West relation were unprecedented in post-World War II terms. The Soviet Union was experiencing fundamental failures. And they went across a large gamut of Marxist-Leninist objectives. Demographic, what you're seeing in Tashkent and Armenia, but also in Eastern Europe and among more traditionally aligned Soviet minorities, which will soon be minorities in the collective. Economic failure, ideological failure in the developing world. The excesses in Afghanistan accomplished what American diplomacy was never able to accomplish. It turned the third world off the Soviet Union as their historic hope for the future. And it was at a juncture like that we had to recognize that linkage was an important aspect of beginning to achieve improvement, both in regional terms, as Harold pointed out, but in a more basic sense, that the Soviet Union have to understand what they get in the way of credit and trade and technology transfer and international credibility and legitimacy and arms control doesn't proceed along a mindless track which ignores the realities of the de facto issue of linkage. And so you never have had, in my view, as an administration, the luxury of saying you have a linkage policy or you don't have a linkage policy. It's a non sequitur. You live with linkage. We see that today. Here we've had in Washington this great orgy of euphoria after Mr. Gorbachev's visit, and a INF treaty that double zeros, which I continue to believe is not in the best interest of the United States or those who share our values around the world, but that's a side issue. We now find that because of a little hanky-panky and forked tongue problems in our own foggy bottom, and the dilemma that's posed with respect to the Afghan pullout, that the Soviets are applying linkage with a vengeance, as Mr. Shevardnadze did to George Shultz several weeks ago. Everything's pretty well stopped. Huh? Why? They claim we double-crossed them. Incidentally, with some justification on their part, although the double cross is the right solution.
That's the first apologia for Soviet policy that I've heard from a former Secretary of State. Al Drishler.
Mr. Secretary, I'm Al Drishler, Foreign Policy Institute. I'd like to get you back to your question of sustainability and coherence to policy in the region. Hal Sonnenfeld mentioned about the ambivalence and uncertainty associated with war powers. And certainly if you look at the debate in the Senate on the issue of reflagging associated with war powers, all they succeeded in doing is making a confused situation still more confused. I'd like to ask, is there any hope for war powers, in your judgment? And if not, how do you work with the Congress to bring them into the business of providing sustainability and coherence to U.S. foreign policy?
May I go back to the stump? It's my view that the most important challenge facing the next administration is a conscious and unrelenting effort to reestablish a partnership of responsibility between the executive and the legislative branch. Until we do that, such manifestations of war powers and undercutting their overriding presidential vetoes, Contra thing, are going to plague every American president. There's a historic cause for that. We have developed anarchy in the legislature of the United States. One man, one vote. The more outrageous and radical the junior member of the committee is, the more headlines he gets, the more courageous he looks, too frequently in the media, television. That's going to take some very careful work. Means that the next president, in my view, is going to have to spend at least 1 or 2 days of every week reestablishing communication with the leaders of the important committees of foreign relations, defense, and frequently budget in a bipartisan way to help to construct policy more on a consensus a priori rather than a series of jolts and shocks. And you can't start out every Friday bringing Time and Newsweek in as an administration to brag on how well you did the week before enrolling the American Congress. And in that process, they strike back, and they're striking back with a vengeance today. So that's the first order of business, and it's going to take a great deal of vision and patience. And I think a lot of these problems would dissipate if we can once again... And incidentally, if these leaders who come over and sit down at that cabinet table with the president and his staff go back to their respective zoos, what I call the legislative anarchy, and they've been able to produce, and they are the fountain of wisdom, and they are the people who can influence this president from his own insanities. The next thing you know, we are reestablishing the authority and credibility that they must have to have a coherent legislature, totally lacking today, and which we have historically enjoyed. That died with Vietnam. That's a partial answer. I could go on for hours on what we have to do.
There's an interesting thought there, the establishment of ambassadors between the Congress and the executive branch is a whole new scope for diplomacy. Much needed.
We have a few volunteers.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the question here, but before I do, I'd like to give two assumptions, and I hope they will be correct assumptions. That the first assumption that there's been a mellowing down of the relation between certain GCC country and the United States, and there is a sort of growing relation with the Soviet Union. And the second assumption is that it is extremely important to the United States that the Soviet will stay out of the whole thing and will not have a stake. If we take the two assumptions in consideration, then the question is that what can and should the United States do to prevent that from happening, to keep the Soviet at bay?
If I understand the question, it is how does the U.S., you assume that the U.S. should try, and if so, how does the U.S. succeed in keeping Soviet influence with the GCC states down and Soviet influence in the region down? Is that correct? Jeff, you raised the issue earlier, I think.
Well, I mean, let me put forward a sort of proposition that it's banal, but I think it's correct. The better the United States relationship with the GCC countries at all levels, diplomatic, economic, military, the less scope for Soviet mischief and game playing that would be seen as inimical to the United States interests. Having said that, I think it's wrong to assume we can keep them out. If by keeping them out you mean, you know, keeping them back behind some curtain somewhere, they're there, they're going to be there, and probably they're going to be there in greater presence than we've ever seen before. The question is, how do we manage their presence there? And that requires, it seems to be, some delicate thought, and that's where I think Secretary Haig is absolutely right, that we and the Europeans have a great deal to talk about, because the Europeans don't always see eye to eye with the United States on how to manage Soviet diplomacy and Soviet military activity. So, quick answers are, one, I think we have to think through more carefully what our own strategic and security relationship with the Gulf is, and iron out some of these contradictions in our arms policy. And secondly, talk to the Europeans on the assumption you're never going to clean the Soviets out.
Hal Sonnenfeld had a comment.
I think we need to grow up a bit on this issue. There is no way in which we can stop the Soviets from cultivating relations and connections in one way or another with the GCC states or with almost anybody else in the Middle East or almost anybody else anyplace. We need to learn that the establishment of diplomatic relations or even trading relations is not synonymous with the Soviets controlling the flow of events. In many respects, the Soviet interests and those of the Gulf states and the oil-producing states are at odds. They may both be interested in high petroleum prices, but you're not going to get high petroleum prices unless there's a danger to the flow of Gulf from the oil, of the oil from the Gulf, at least for the foreseeable future, as long as the supply-demand situation is what it is, and that is on the whole not in the interest of the Gulf states. There are the Muslim issues in the Soviet Union, which produce built-in problems between the Soviets and many parts of the region. Even if the Soviets, as they're doing at the moment, propitiate the Shiites in Azerbaijan at the expense of the Christians in Armenia, with some sops to the Armenians, that is temporary and tactical, because the Soviets can only go so far in propitiating the Muslims in their own country. And there are many other issues of this sort that I believe put some degree of limit on how far Soviet influence in this part of the world is going to evolve. I think also we should understand that while undoubtedly the Soviets have managed to broaden their relationships in the Gulf, in the Arabian Peninsula, and in the region overall, that very fact has also diluted their relations with some of the countries in the area with which they were very close in the past, whether that is Iraq, where probably what the Soviets have done in the way of turning on and off the arms tap will never be forgotten, regardless of who rules the country. And with Syria, and with Egypt, I would guess with Libya as well. Those used to be the anchors in the Soviet position in the region, and I would guess for every Saudi Arabia or GCC state with which the Soviets have managed to establish some kind of relationship, their ability to rely upon or use for their own purposes other Arab and Muslim states and entities in the area has been reduced. So I think we need to be a little more balanced and mature in this without being complacent about the Soviet role. Yes, we should be talking to the Europeans. Yes, we should be talking to the region. Yes, we should be talking to the Soviets themselves to see if there are some understandings and ground rules concerning various activities. But all of those things, I think, have to be done with a great deal of care and caution. And here, the congressional picture, I think, is a very crucial one, because Congress determines our aid programs and our other economic relationships with the parties in the region, and that's a major factor as well. So we have a multidimensional game going on here, but I think we'd all be better off if we became a little less obsessed with the notion that a mere Soviet presence constitutes what will ultimately become Soviet control. I think in this part of the world that is almost less likely than in any other part of the world.
Al?
Let me just make a very brief observation because I agree with what both Jeff and Hal have said, especially the connotation that it's a management of the Soviet presence that we're dealing with, not a cordon sanitaire. If we pursue that kind of a mindless policy, we sometimes get the worst outcome. The Soviets are not going to be deprived. When they were expelled from Egypt and their diplomatic activity was terminated in the region, they immediately began to engage in other mischiefs in Ethiopia and Angola, Yemen, perhaps even in Afghanistan. So there's no, it would be unsound to believe that you can conduct your affairs that way. But what you do have to do, and what worries me a little bit about what Hal said is, and I don't know, it's this current debate in Washington on the peace process, with some obvious shifting in the State Department on the question of an international conference. The question has to be asked, not do you keep the Soviets out just as a mindless preoccupation. The question is, will their participation make a constructive effort towards the outcome that we seek? Now there, I think you could have a raging debate in this crowd today. And I'm not going to get into it, but that's the issue. Not just keeping the Soviets out of some mindless vision of the future.
Yes, it would certainly seem that it's both impossible and inadvisable to try to keep the Soviets from having relations with the people in the region. And indeed, to know the Soviets is not to love them. And that's probably even more true of the Soviet Union than of the United States. All right. We have time for about one more question. Let me take it here.
I have a question about reflagging, the reflagging issue. I know a number of people, particularly on Capitol Hill, have mentioned an issue that, or actually have mentioned a country that has not been mentioned this morning, and yet a country that's very, very directly linked to the question of reflagging, and that's Japan. There's the impression among some people that the result of the reflagging operation was simply to subsidize the export of Iranian crude to Japan, since the Iranians are the greatest beneficiaries of the reflagging operations, not the Iraqis, who get a lot of their oil out through the pipeline. So the question is, to you gentlemen, do you see any possibility of integrating the Japanese into this matter, particularly when it comes to paying for the reflagging operation?
Who wants to begin?
But it cannot be it cannot flow against the terms of the Japanese Constitution and the nervousness of their ASEAN friends in the context of their militaristic future. There are countless ways. It may well be that some are already underway, and I suspect they are, with respect to certain subsidies costs being picked up for American forces in Japan, and modifications in a number of trading areas, and the heavy role that Japan has and continues to play in assistance to developing nations.
Anyone else?
No, I think that's absolutely correct.
I think that's correct. One more. Back. Yes.
I'm Henry Ryan. I'm here at SAIS. If I understood you correctly, I believe I did. It's a perilous undertaking at the moment, a perilous policy in the Gulf. It could lead to an escalation with Iran, in which case Iran would very likely turn to the Soviet Union for assistance. Do I have that possible escalation correctly? If I do, my question is, what would the Soviets' reaction be, particularly if part of the equation is a need for military assistance, not just diplomatic? Would they be willing to countenance this vis-a-vis the United States in the Gulf?
You mean, would the Soviets be willing to
give any kind of assistance to Iran in any sort of a military way.
They have.
I mean in military action. I don't mean
in
in
military
supply.
action. Well, no, first let me say, I don't think the Iranians really want this, but in the event of an extremist action by the United States, a very severe blow, perhaps taking out all of their missile sites, the kind of thing that we're going to have to consider in the event of a provocation in the near future. Nations can live with contradictions temporarily in order to relieve the urgent problems they face. And I think it's perfectly conceivable that the Iranian government, this current government, could strike a temporary partnership with the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union would relish, and which the Iranians have been forced into because their own vital interests are going to be the ultimate decision maker. It's conceivable. We've seen more strange things throughout history.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and I'd again particularly like to thank Secretary Haig for appearing on such short notice and for providing such a coherent picture. Thank you.
You've been watching a forum on the United States and Persian Gulf security held by the Johns Hopkins Foreign Policy Institute. We'd like to remind our viewers that on Sunday at about 1:25 p.m. Eastern Time, C-SPAN will present this week's hearing on the recent turmoil on the occupied West Bank area and Gaza Strip. This hearing was held before the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Human Rights and International Organizations. Again, that's tomorrow at about 1:25 p.m. Eastern Time, 10:25 a.m. on the Pacific Coast.
The C-SPAN call-in program is different from most other television programs. The role here is not to create exciting television. We're not interested in ratings. The host is not the star of the show. It's not named after any of our hosts. The program belongs to the viewers. It's a C-SPAN call-in program.
Up next on C-SPAN, from Houston, Texas, Republican members of the U.S. House of Representatives discuss the Congress of Tomorrow, the theme for the meeting this past weekend.
The first in that order, and I'd like to express my appreciation to each of you for the help that you were in those individual sessions, but in the energy area, let me call on Jack Fields. Jack?
They've given us all just a limited amount of time, but I think two thank yous are in order. First of all, to Jerry Lewis. I hope all of you have enjoyed this conference the way I have, and this conference would not have been possible without Jerry and his staff. So, Jerry, on behalf of all of us, thank you. And then secondly, and I understand perhaps some of my colleagues will come up a little later and do the same thing, but I want to thank all of you for coming to Houston. This is an extremely difficult time for our city and for our state. Since 1982, 300,000 people in the petroleum industry have been laid off. So you coming to Houston sends a tremendous message not only to our city but also to our state. And I've watched your comments on TV, read them in the newspaper, and it's all extremely positive. And let me give you one other context before I go into my little presentation. In 1972, there were 2.2 million Democrats voting in a primary. This year, there were about 1.5 million, and there were 1 million people voting in the Republican primary. So in the state of Texas, we are the dynamic party. We are the party of movement. This year, the Democrats chose to go to Atlanta after they made a great visible mistake of not choosing Houston. Houston was on their short list. And they not only not chose Houston, but they said they would have preferred to choose New Orleans, but since we had already chosen New Orleans, they couldn't go there. So really, we were third on their list. So you coming here has sent a real message to the people that we're the people who are interested in Texas and in Houston. So I really appreciate that. I know others will probably express the same thing. Now, I wish all of you could have gone to our conference. We had the best meal. We had country western music. We had some great facilitators, and Mike the Ox, Oprah Winfrey Oxley, and we had Bob, Phil Donahue, Livingston. And I guess if there was one operative word of our conference coming from our panel and from the people in our audience, it was the word incentives and not subsidies. In fact, we had two of the independent leaders in the oil and gas industry who said they did not support any type of oil import fee, but instead they needed incentives like a greater depletion allowance in the tax code. And during the discussion, Ox and Bob Livingston pointed out that the problem in the energy industry was not with us in Congress, but with the Democrats. The Democrats have given us the windfall profits tax, which has taken $38 billion out of the energy industry. They gave us in 1978 the Natural Gas Policy Act, which is going to keep 36 to 52 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in the ground. It's been the Democrats who put federal lands off limits for exploration and production. It's been the Democrats who have given us moratoriums, who are now opposing the development of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and so forth and so on. Also, during the discussion, Bud Scoggins and Sonny Callahan pointed out that sometimes the difficulty we have in Congress, particularly on the Energy and Commerce Committee, is finding agreement among the different segments of the energy industry. That sometimes things are so fragmented we don't know exactly what is the best thing to increase the energy supply of this country. And that's something that not only should we work toward, but it's also something that people in industry need to recognize and work toward with us. Now, as was pointed out in our tape, Harris Faywell reminded all of us that oil and gas was not the only solution to our energy problem, that we did need to develop clean coal technology, that we did need to place emphasis on our nuclear industry. And I thought it extremely important. Roy Huffington, who is one of the wealthiest individuals in the world, who has gone all over the globe, deserts, jungles, finding oil and gas, saying that if he was a young man, he would put all of his effort and energy in developing a nuclear industry for this country. And Harris also pointed out that in Congress, we've got to give increased support for financial funding for some of these renewable energy programs, and that also we came back to the word incentive for the private sector. And our last discussion was on product sales and how our Commerce Department sometimes denies equipment that can be bought off the shelf in other countries, how we deny our own companies the market to go into countries and sell some of the products that can be bought anyplace else. And as a conclusion, we're going to suggest to Jerry and to the leader that there be a meeting set up with the president where we can not only discuss some of the findings of our particular conference, but also the other conferences. And also we want to report our findings to the existing Energy Task Force of Research and Development, and hopefully this will be shared with everyone else in the conference.
All of us have agreed that education is fundamental to that which is a Republican future, and to help us a little more with that, Lynn Martin.
Thank you. It may not have struck you, but every single panel, even in the brief film, mentioned education. So it is not just something separate. It turns out it is absolutely intermingled with anything we wish to do. In the panel yesterday, or in the day that we had concentrating on education, Steve Bartlett joined as a co-facilitator and did a superb job. We had Dick Armey and Barbara Vukanovich. You saw Ralph Regula, Jim Bunning, Mike DeWine, and it was a group whose interest was both personal and professional. What do we do for our children and our children's children? The day, just let me tell you what the day was, because first we met with students. I'm going to give you, unlike everybody else's report, that will probably tell you all the nices. I'm not sure our panel would agree that we came up with the kinds of solutions we could have hoped to achieve. First of all, we had hoped to meet with a mixed group of students from throughout the Houston schools. We all wanted to be with the kids. The Houston Public Schools said no, because we were a partisan group, which is kind of interesting. That's too bad, isn't it? Because this has been such a wonderful city. Now, the University of Houston went terrifically, and we met with their honor students. They give you confidence in what's going to happen in the future. But we wanted to meet with some of the kids for whom education is the only door. Not necessarily just the best and brightest. But those honor students were terrific, and I will tell you, when we asked them, did they have any questions or comments, we could have gone 8 hours. No one had to tell them that they should be afraid of members of Congress. They were at us immediately. Then we listened to Paul Chu, who is the leading expert on superconductivity, is brilliant.